As you might be able to tell from my channel, I'm a pretty big fan of RPGs. I got introduced to them by games aimed for children like Paper Mario and Pokemon, and have been hooked ever since. But despite my lifelong love for the genre, I actually haven't interacted much with some of its longest running series, including Final Fantasy. In fact, the only Final Fantasy I ever played was the GBA remake of Final Fantasy I, which I blitzed through in a couple of days while recovering from surgery. Aside from that, I've played through the whole Bravely series, which uses the same classes and spells, and I played Final Fantasy Tactics for the first time last year on stream. And that was the game that inspired me to finally give this series a chance. I know, obviously, mainline Final Fantasy is going to function quite differently from the Tactics spin-off, since it is a more traditional RPG, or at the very least, it starts out that way. But I'm still eager to see what the series has to offer, and I thought it would be interesting to go through and document my experiences with them as a brand new Final Fantasy fan in the year 2026. And with that in mind, there's probably no worse place to start than the one game that I've already played, but I want to do this chronologically, so we're starting with Final Fantasy I. Although, I guess in some ways, I haven't really played Final Fantasy I, have I? I played the Game Boy Advance remake Dawn of Souls, which made a number of significant mechanical changes to the NES original. And many of these changes were quite controversial, to the extent that the most high-profile future remake, the Pixel Remaster, reverted them almost entirely back to how things functioned on the Nintendo Entertainment System. So, since FF1 is relatively short, I thought a fun idea would be to play through 3 separate times. Once on the NES, once on the GBA, and once using the Pixel Remaster, and compare these 3 versions to each other in order to finally definitively decide what is the best version of Final Fantasy I. To be clear, these aren't the only versions of Final Fantasy I. There have been dozens of remakes, and all of them have had small tweaks, but I think these represent the 3 most prominent candidates. On the NES is the original, the Pixel Remaster is the newest, and the GBA is the most distinct from the other 2. And after playing through all 3 of these games, I can definitely say that, yeah, they're all fun. The core story and mechanics of Final Fantasy I are solid enough that if you're a fan of old school RPGs, you're probably going to enjoy it no matter what version you play. So before diving into the differences and comparing the 3 versions to each other, I want to briefly go over the core Final Fantasy experience. Right off the bat, Final Fantasy separates itself from its contemporaries because instead of having a fixed party of story-important characters, you create the 4 heroes of light yourself by giving them names and selecting what classes they'll be. It's not an intense and complex character creator as you might see in modern RPGs, but selecting your specific party makeup is still going to have a huge impact on how your journey goes. The warrior is a traditional melee combatant, and can equip almost every weapon and armor in the game. As such, his standard attacks will deal a lot of damage, and he's very tanky. But in order to have him scale to his maximum potential, you're going to have to either purchase new equipment or find it while exploring the dungeons. The monk, in contrast, demands almost no financial support, as he focuses on bare-handed attacks. Monks follow a special damage formula when unarmed, and so at high levels, they can have some of the most devastating attacks in the game. But it takes them a little bit to get off the ground, so the early game is typically going to be rougher for monks. Additionally, since they can't use most armor and weapons, monks are going to be quite frail, leading them to assume the glass cannon role. The last of the martial classes, Thief, falls somewhere in the middle of warrior and monk. They can use some weapons, such as daggers and leather armor, but not all of the fancy swords and metal plate that warrior have access to. Additionally, instead of specializing in strength, thieves focus on speed, which means they will often move first in a round of combat, have very good evasion, accuracy, and increase your chances to run away. They're not going to be the best at raw combat, but they can function as a reliable supplemental member to your team. The other three classes are more magically oriented. For the most part, the White Mage focuses on healing and defense-oriented spells, making her a premier support unit as she can keep the team healthy and patch them up, which not only helps in terms of money, but can often just be more action efficient than using healing items, especially when it comes to the late game revival spells. The White Mage does also get a few offense-oriented spells, mostly focused on killing undead foes, and can output surprisingly decent melee damage with her hammers. So even on turns where everyone is at full HP, she's going to have something to do. As you might expect, the Black Mage is the exact opposite. His spells focus on straightforward attacks, offensive buffs, and the ability to inflict status conditions, and at least one of these effects will be useful to you in every fight. Against large squads, AoE attacks are going to be your fastest kills, and against bosses, Temper and Haste are generally considered the best strategies for taking them down. But because the Black Mage is casting spells far more often than the White Mage, you can quickly find yourself drained of resources, and when the Black Mage is incapable of casting any more spells, they're basically dead weight on the team, as they struggle to output damage and are incredibly frail as well. Of course, if you'd rather not have either of these extremes, the Red Mage is basically made for you. He is the jack-of-all-trades, master of none, and as such, he's capable of doing both black and white magic, albeit to a lesser degree than either of the specialists. And it's worth acknowledging that he's not just a spellcaster. The Red Mage can equip a decent amount of weapons and armor, so he also functions as a competent, although not phenomenal, melee unit. The Red Mage will never be the best class for the job, but he's also never going to be the worst one either, which can be valuable if you are interested in role compression instead of specialization. Although it is worth noting the Red Mage can be very expensive, as he not only needs to pay for spells, but also wants access to new weapons and armor on a semi-frequent basis. It's also worth noting that roughly halfway through the game, each of these classes gets the opportunity to promote. The most extreme changes happen to the Warrior and Thief, as the Warrior's upgraded class Knight has access to low-level white magic, whereas the Thief's upgraded class Ninja has access to low-level black magic. The other four just become better versions of themselves, gaining access to new spells, weapons, or in the Master's case, a better damage formula, but do not fundamentally change any aspects about how they play. While this party customization makes the Heroes of Light less iconic than other RPG parties, I would argue that it makes Final Fantasy stand out in a positive way. Your party is your own, and you're forging your own story with them. And on replays, having a different team makeup can cause challenges to feel fundamentally different. If you're running a squad with no warriors, then suddenly even generic enemies are threatening as damage stacks up much faster. But in contrast, if you have too many knights, your early economy will suffer greatly. If you've already played through Final Fantasy and are looking for a fresher experience, then changing up your team dynamic can do wonders. It's part of why I was willing to do 3 back-to-back playthroughs of essentially the same game. Obviously, customization isn't the only thing that makes a game replayable. Plenty of folks replay things like Mario Brothers or whatnot, but it's hard to deny that it can help. And this degree of customization was relatively revolutionary for the 1980s. Of course, the downside was all 4 of the protagonists were pretty bland. In fact, calling them bland feels like an understatement. Not only are they silent protagonists who don't speak a single word, but they don't even really have personality traits beyond just being good. And as a result, the story of Final Fantasy I isn't particularly deep or complex. But For me personally, this lack of complexity was actually pretty refreshing. Rather than being given text dumps naming a ton of kings and countries who I won't remember in an hour, the game just dropped me in front of the first major settlement, where I learned the princess had been kidnapped and went to go rescue her. After a little bit of wandering around and grinding, I confronted and killed the evil knight Garland at the Chaos Shrine and rescued the princess. As a reward, her father rebuilt the bridge to the mainland, and so I crossed it and went to the next village to find they were being attacked by pirates. After I beat up the pirates, they gave me their ship, and this opened up access to even more of the world. Here I find a dungeon, and after delving as deep as I can reach, I find the missing crown of the elves. And so I go return it to the Elf King, but surprise, he's actually a Dark Elf in disguise, and he tries to kill me. After killing the Dark Elf King, he drops a magic eyeball, and hey, we encountered a blind witch earlier, so I go and return it to her, and she brews me a potion of awakening as thanks. The potion of awakening can be used to cure the elf prince that was put into a magical sleep, and he gives me a magical key as thanks, which I can use to find a bomb that can be used to blow up a channel and allow me access to the western half of the world, and you get the idea. Rather than featuring a singular overarching story, Final Fantasy I has small, almost episodic adventures that all lead into each other because their conclusions unlock the next part of the world, which is where the next little adventure happens. In many ways, it feels like a D&D campaign that went thoroughly off the rails, but everyone is still having fun as the DM frantically adapts to the party's hijinks. And the fact that your party is so customizable doubles down on this feeling, which, from what I can gather, is at least somewhat intentional on the devs' part. The classes, and especially enemies, bear a strong resemblance to what you would find in D&D at the time, and in fact, the original Japanese version of Final Fantasy I had a beholder, but they had to remove it as that was copyrighted by Wizards of the Coast. And while it's true that things like hobgoblins and slimes are fairly standard fantasy elements, the biggest piece of evidence for this theory, in my opinion, is the game's magic system. You see, rather than using mana to cast your spells, spellcasters gain spell slots as they level up, just like in Dungeons & Dragons. Each of these spell slots correspond with a different spell level. So, for example, if you have 2 level 1 spell slots and 1 level 2 spell slot, you can cast 2 level 1 spells and 1 level 2 spell before you have to rest and restore all of your slots. Each spell level has 4 white magic spells and 4 black magic spells associated with it, although each spellcaster can only equip 3 at a time, and they must be purchased from shops in the various towns you visit. This means that even for white mages and black mages, they're going to be abandoning 1 spell per level, and red mages have to be even more careful about what they choose to get. One cool thing about this system is it means even as you get later into the campaign, your low-level spells are still valuable, since they're functionally drawing from a different resource than your high-level ones, and you can cast them much more often. For example, you might be able to cast 7 level 1 spells, but only 3 level 4 spells. So if you're faced off against especially weak enemies, you might as well use the lower level spell and conserve the higher one for the bosses. Additionally, in contrast to standard mana systems, this avoids the problem where a cheap spell is far stronger than the devs intended, and so people just spam it rather than using all of their options. And without the spell slot system, Final Fantasy would fall victim to this issue, as the haste and temper spells, relatively low-level black magic, are undeniably the best buffs available to you. But since you can only cast them a limited number of times between rests, you have to take more creative approaches to standard encounters and save them for the tricky bosses and mini-bosses. Overall, I think it's a pretty cool system, and I would love to see it implemented in other more complex RPGs, especially because outside of the spell slot system, combat in Final Fantasy is not particularly interesting. As long as you have a relatively well set up party, for standard encounters, typically the best strategy is to spam the attack button, with only minor deviations, such as if you encounter undead with a white mage, or if you're facing against an enemy with strong defense and have a black mage. Against bosses, you spam attack while buffing your damage dealers with haste and temper, and maybe giving them defensive buffs like shield and blink. The most excitement that I got from random encounters was realizing that a hero was too damaged and needed a heal, or that they'd been status inflicted and I needed to use the proper cure item. Although, speaking of status, they don't really add complexity to the gameplay so much as frustration. Aside from poison, almost every status is just a different flavor of stopping your unit from being able to act. There's sleep, paralyzed, stone, and the only thing that really distinguishes them is they get cured by different items and spells. And most of them are applied with some degree of RNG outside of your control. For example, the standard attacks from most undead have a chance to paralyze you. Poison isn't any more interesting either. You can at least still act while poisoned, but it's also just randomly applied by tarantulas and other poisonous enemies. And poison maintains after battle as well as even after a full rest, so if you don't address it, your character will eventually die. For this reason, one of the big pieces of advice that people give for the first major dungeon is to stock up on a ton of potions and antitoxins. Which ties into the other major criticism I have for Final Fantasy I, the game requires a lot of grinding. Okay, technically grinding's not required, you could always get lucky with dodges and critical hits and avoiding random enemy encounters, but for the most part, you're going to want a lot more experience and especially gold than are offered to you in the linear story. Even in my playthrough that had 2 monks and therefore only had to spend gold on half of the party members, I found myself routinely strapped for money. And because the avenues for strategy are quite limited in this game, if you're running up against a boss that you don't think you can beat, grinding for experience is also probably the best course of action. Even when not going out of your way to grind, the game has a lot of random encounters. And running away is far from guaranteed, so you're probably going to end up accidentally doing quite a bit of grind-like activity. I've always been something of a grinding hater, and while I've softened on it a little bit this year, thanks to playing games where grinding is fun, such as Final Fantasy Tactics or Marvel Midnight Suns, in Final Fantasy I do very much feel that the grind is not enjoyable. In fact, because of it, I spent a lot of time playing Final Fantasy on my second monitor while paying attention to movies on my primary one. And like I said at the start, I still enjoyed myself during these playthroughs, but I find it unlikely that I would have had as much fun if they were the sole focus of my attention. You heard me right, Netflix. This RPG from 1987 is peak second screen content. So do with that information what you will. Still, it feels unfair to hold an NES game to the standards of modern RPGs. This was quite an accomplishment for the time, and since it's only 20 hours long, a relatively short entry in the RPG genre, I would recommend anyone who hasn't played Final Fantasy to check it out. Although, bringing us back to the question at the core of this video, it's time to find out which entry would be the best to look at. I'll start by saying this. If you are looking to this video to figure out which version you want to play, then you definitely don't want to play the NES version. That's not to say the NES version is bad. In fact, I think it is quite good. I enjoyed my time with it. And I don't even think it is necessarily the worst of these 3 versions. But I think it is suited for a very specific audience. The sort of gamer who is more tolerant of the old school jank that you would associate with a NES game. If you're the sort of person for whom the original Famicom Final Fantasy would be the best way to experience Final Fantasy I, then you don't need me to tell you that, you already know. But for anyone who's not really into old school games, the NES version has a lot of significant drawbacks. The gameplay, and especially the battles, are going to be quite slow. And while you can use emulator speedup to get around this, I've always found that to be an imperfect solution, because it not only distorts the audio so you don't get to listen to the beautiful soundtrack, but it also rushes things to the extent where you have the opposite problem, and now it can be hard to take in information or accurately input as things are going fast. But the slower pace of older games is only the start of Final Fantasy I's issues. Your character names are limited to 3 letters long, presumably due to system memory. But with only 3 letters per name, your creativity is going to be very limited. And due to a combination of glitches and poor balancing oversights, your creativity when it comes to team building is also going to feel constrained. Warrior, or Fighter as it's called on the NES, is by far the strongest class in Final Fantasy I. Not because it has any specific buffs as compared to the remakes, but because almost all of the other classes have significant issues that were fixed moving forward. Thief was definitely the primary victim of this. When going over classes, I described Thief's agility as making them more accurate, more dodgy, and better at running away. But that's only really true of the remakes. In the original Final Fantasy, agility doesn't help all that much. It doesn't actually impact the ability to run away or your accuracy. And while it has an impact on evasion, it's a minimal one. You only gain 1 point of evasiveness per agility. As such, the Thief is mostly just a strictly worse version of the Warrior. I mean, eventually as a ninja you get access to Temper and Haste, which are incredibly valuable, but if you want a combatant with access to Temper and Haste, you just go with the Red Mage. Although, on the topic of the Red Mage, magical classes were impacted pretty severely by what I can only assume is a coding error. The Wisdom stat, which should correspond with an increase in magical aptitude, just doesn't do anything. It is literally a worthless number. It doesn't translate to anything gameplay-wise. And so, as such, your healing magic and offensive magic is less potent than it's supposed to be, and this gets worse the higher your level is. But I think the class that gets hurt in the funniest way is Monk, or Black Belt. It functions mostly the same as it does in the remakes, but upon promoting from Black Belt to Master, they actually lose magic defense growth, which means their level ups will be slightly worse. And in particular, it means they're more vulnerable to status effects. This glitch was corrected in later versions, and the Master actually got a new damage formula that is better than the Monk's when it comes to barehanded attacks, but I still find it to be incredibly funny. And that, I guess, would be the primary reason to play the NES version. If you're fine with old school jank and want to experience the funny glitches and oversights like the Peninsula of Power, or just awkward and stilted dialogue from the old translations, this is the way to do that. But if you want an experience more aligned with modern design sensibilities, then I would recommend one of the remakes. The Dawn of Souls remake not only aligns classes more closely to their intended roles with a variety of buffs, nerfs, and bug fixes, but it also ties the whole package together with some downright beautiful pixel art. Like, seriously, this is one of the most gorgeous Game Boy Advance games I've ever seen. Dawn of Souls also adds a number of optional dungeons that are considered to be the biggest challenges in Final Fantasy. Full disclosure, I didn't really spend much time in these dungeons myself. I don't think the combat is deep enough for me to want to engage with something more difficult than the final boss, But if you are looking for the ultimate challenge, this is where you'd find it. There's also a newly added bestiary, which doesn't do much mechanically, but is always a cool world-building feature in my opinion. And if that was the extent of the changes, I would say Dawn of Souls is the definitive best version of Final Fantasy I. But unfortunately, the biggest change Dawn of Souls makes is a complete overhaul of the magic system. Now, instead of using spell slots, all the mages have a mana stat, and that mana can be spent for any spell you want. I'll be honest, on a knee-jerk level, I don't like this change just because it takes something unique away from the original game and turns it into a much more generic RPG. I understand why so many games use mana systems, it is a good system, but I think Final Fantasy I functioned perfectly fine with the spell slots. There's no reason to mess with something that isn't broken. And by taking away one of its unique features, it also takes away one of the main reasons to play the game. But beyond just being more generic, the mana system kind of fundamentally messes with the gameplay loop of FF1. Especially since the mana costs of lower level spells are incredibly trivial. Even in the early game, you'll be able to cast spells like Cure and Heal a plethora of times before getting exhausted. And once you reach the mid-game, you no longer ever have to worry about healing in between battles. So long as you have either a white mage or red mage, you can top up your entire team anytime you want. And so this has the side effect of making dungeons way easier than they used to be. You see, in Final Fantasy I, dungeons were an endurance test. You go in and fight your way through multiple floors, making do with only the resources you brought. And since all of your spells have a limited number of casts, you can't just spam healing magic to avoid resource management. Of course, if you're willing to grind, you can just buy 99 of all healing potions and trivialize things that way, but at that point, you're kind of doing it to yourself. Meanwhile, in my playthrough, I did very little grinding, but still never found myself running out of resources in dungeons. I guess you could argue that this makes the gold economy slightly better since you don't need to buy healing items anymore, but for me, at best, it feels like one problem covering up for a different problem. Although, maybe the devs' intentions were to make dungeons less dangerous, as, unlike in the original, you can now save inside of dungeons. And I kind of have mixed feelings about the new save system. On the one hand, it is more convenient to be able to save whenever you want, especially on the Game Boy Advance, which is a battery-operated system, so it's prone to potentially dying before you can get to a save point. But on the other hand, the original Final Fantasy only letting you save whenever you could sleep, either by going to an inn or using an item from your inventory, made the wilderness feel much more hostile, in a way that leaned into the Dungeons & Dragons aesthetic. You're in this very untamed, wild place, and you're going to have to deal with the consequences of your actions. And since you can't use sleeping bags, tents, or cottages in dungeons, they were the biggest challenge of all. There's even some spells that allow you to warp to an earlier floor or exit the dungeon entirely, and these don't feel like they serve a purpose anymore. Dungeons themselves are so non-threatening that I don't find myself in need of an emergency exit. By taking away the elements that made FF1 unique, it suddenly feels like there's a lot less reason to play it. It feels much closer to a generic fantasy RPG now. And at least to me, one of the big appeals of Final Fantasy I was all the weird experimental stuff. And I think the community by and large agrees with this assessment because people did not like the changes made in Dawn of Souls. And to their credit, Square Enix listened, as the next big remaster, the Pixel Remaster, reversed things. In many ways, the Pixel Remaster gives you the best of both worlds. The spell slot system is back, but you still have the balanced classes from the Game Boy Advance. The game also added a bunch of cool quality of life features. You can now turn random encounters on and off, so if you're running around the world doing a fetch quest that you don't want to get interrupted by, or just are sick of fighting random mooks, you can always switch it to no longer have random encounters. And in theory, this could also provide a potential challenge run for being at an absurdly low level. There's also sliders for the amount of gold and experience you gain. So again, when grinding, you can gain twice as much experience and gold. Or if you feel like you're too rich and want a challenge, you can stop gaining gold entirely, or just cut down and gain less. For people with nostalgia, you can seamlessly switch between modern music and old school tunes, and there's a mini-map in the top right of the screen, so navigating the world has never been easier. It really feels like this should be the definitive best version of Final Fantasy. But unfortunately, the Pixel Remaster also had some really weird choices it made. Shops' inventories have been expanded to an absurd degree. Now every single item shop sells every item in the game, and that includes ethers, which were not actually an item in the original Final Fantasy, and in Dawn of Souls were incredibly rare, despite the fact that the mana system kind of demands them to exist. I get that, like, being able to restore your spellcaster's ability to cast spells is, in theory, a good thing. It means they're not useless once they run out of spell slots, but to me, it feels like it's working against the dungeon crawl flavor. It's once again just really easy to manage your resources now. If they had to add ether into the game, I would have preferred that it was a very rare item, much like in Dawn of Souls. But ultimately, that's kind of a small quibble. Instead, my biggest frustration with Pixel Remaster is I think it looks kinda ugly. I don't really like how any of the character classes look, and I think at best the enemy designs look fine, although more often than not, I find them to be pretty unappealing. And in not a single case do I prefer them to the GBA sprites. And the menus are downright atrocious. They all have the sort of generic placeholder text you get from an RPG maker, and it doesn't feel like something made by a large AAA publisher. By the end of my playthrough, the graphics for the characters and enemies grew on me, but the menus never did. It always felt just so unprofessional and really off-putting for what would otherwise have been the definitive version of Final Fantasy I. And I guess that is sort of the question at the core of things. Which is better, the game that looks phenomenal but has questionable mechanical choices, or the game that looks just okay but has mostly peak mechanics, even if I have some nitpicks? Personally, I prefer the Dawn of Souls version. For as much issue as I take with it stripping away the uniqueness from Final Fantasy I, if I'm just playing it as second screen material anyway, I'd rather it look and feel gorgeous. But if you want to experience the unique choices and mechanics that caused Final Fantasy to be popular enough to spawn 17 sequels, then I would say the Pixel Remaster is probably the better choice for you. And of course, if you are really hardcore into old school games or just want to experience the jank of days past, then the NES game offers an experience that is truly unique. Although, I'm curious, let me know in the comments, what version of Final Fantasy do you think is best? Be sure to leave me a 5-paragraph essay as to why it's a travesty that I overlooked the Tamagotchi version of Final Fantasy. And hey, if it's convincing enough, I might even delete this video in shame. But until then, I want to say thanks to my patrons. Thank you to Glupshido, Electric Giga, Erica Ford, YLO1, George Grenville, The 7th PM, Jamie Collins, Arvis, Crispy Matthews, Floahay, Amy Hazel, Hungry Heart, Shinthia, Faulty Videos, Kyle Madison, Derek Williams, Anna Cabana, The Daily Foogle, Faye, Magic Bite, Thoughtful Insanity, Robin Goodfeller, JT Spreader, Ziggy WSB, Dysike, Chris, Root Beer Pants, Queen Eliza, Controlled Aegis, Roman Chromantic, Nick Knack, Hammer Smack, Carrier Has Left, Angel Nut Caceres, Zanwiff, Edward C, Cyrockin 2, Cabbage, SUP, Caius Cole, Bree, Punch Fighter Champion, Eggman, Maxine the Vampire Queen, Drakenback Lancer, Sardonic Muse, Zero Gamer, Femtal Illness, Wannabe Cinnabon, Punk Tattoo Guy, Key the Iron Idol, Calamity Callie, Jax McMahon, Saren Gurlixy, Rezi, Andu, Rhea, Gameboo, Carosa, Fyrant, Your Doctor, Frozen Helm, Pat Witt, Pillow, Willow, Girl Boss, Lizard Bongwater, Christopher Bueno, Marin McLean, Jaden, Dylan Solis, Forever Lucas, Some Trades, Guizi555, Smas Ruby, Cycrom, Robin D, Alendi, Hound Dogs, They Thumb, Klon, and especially my Jagans, Your Best Friend 9000, Adele, Alexander Roper, Sensitive Luigi, Siggy, and Lil Man. Also, while I was editing this video, I got a new patron named Pergnite. So thank you, Pergnite, and welcome to the pre-promote tier. If you want to have your name join these lovely people on screen, then there's a link to my Patreon down below, but please only donate if you can comfortably afford to do so. I don't want anyone going broke for Fire Emblem. Oh wait, this is FF, not FE. I don't want anyone going broke for Final Fantasy. Likes, comments, subscribes, all that stuff are free ways to support the channel, but regardless of what you choose to do, I hope you have a wonderful day. Stay safe, gamers.